After the harrowing event that nearly claimed Sophia's life, her world became fragile and silent. Her body was broken, her trust shattered, and her heart scarred, making the path to recovery seem nearly impossible. Yet in the darkest of days, a light remained unwavering. Snowy, the family's loyal German shepherd. No longer just a witness to the crime, Snowy became a symbol of steadfast loyalty and a pillar of strength, staying beside Sophia through every step of her journey back to life. Edward Montgomery had always been a mysterious man. A man whom the world around him saw as calm, sophisticated, but few knew the dark shadows hiding within him. He was a father, a husband, but beneath that facade was a cruelty that could not be concealed. To his family, friends, and acquaintances, he appeared as a successful man with an unblemished reputation for morality and care for his family. However, behind all of that was a person who harbored haunting demons and an unshakable darkness. Sophia Montgomery, Edward's only daughter, was the one who knew him better than anyone else, aware of the darker aspects of her father that no one else could fathom. Sophia, a beautiful girl with bright eyes and sharp intellect, had endured a life filled with suffering under the hand of a father who was nothing like the one the world believed him to be. However, a terrible accident when she was young had left her paralyzed, confined to a wheelchair for life. That accident, which many saw as a tragic mishap, was a deep wound in Sophia's soul. It not only robbed her of the ability to move but also gradually isolated her from everything she once cherished in life. Despite this, Sophia always tried to maintain a strong spirit, but what she had endured at the hands of her father was an unforgettable pain. And in her heart, there was always a fierce worry that her father, the man she once loved, might hurt her again. The trip begins. That day, Edward had planned a trip. He told Sophia it would be an opportunity for her to relax, to escape the confines of the room she had spent years confined to. Edward claimed he had found a peaceful spot in a remote mountain area where no one would disturb them. Sophia, though knowing her father's nature, could not refuse the invitation. She felt that perhaps this would be a chance for the two of them to better understand each other. When they arrived, Edward carefully helped Sophia out of the car, then pushed her along a winding trail through the green forest. Although she could no longer fully appreciate the surroundings as she once did, Sophia still felt a slight sense of peace from nature. But in Edward's eyes, there was something strange that she could not understand. He said this trip was for her, but in her heart, she had a sense of unease that she could not explain. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the sounds of birds chirping and the rustling wind seemed insufficient to calm Sophia's growing tension. She sensed something was wrong, but she couldn't voice it. Edward continued to maintain a calm demeanor, even trying to engage her in trivial conversation, but his eyes were constantly watching, observing her every move, as though he were calculating something. Signs of danger. When they reached a large cliff, Edward stopped. Jagged stones jutted out from the cliff, looking down at a deep, vast chasm below. Sophia felt dizzy but tried to stay calm. She couldn't understand why her father had stopped here. Edward turned to her, his gaze now sharp, full of determination she had never seen before. He said, "You know, Sophia, sometimes life requires bold decisions. Everything must change." Sophia could only offer a weak smile, unsure how to respond. But deep inside, she felt a rising fear. She wanted to leave, to flee from this feeling, but she couldn't. She was trapped, confined to the wheelchair, her hands hanging limp, eyes fixed on her father. Edward approached her. He said nothing more but simply stared at her for a moment. Then, without warning, he shoved the wheelchair toward the cliff. The dark moment. Everything happened too quickly. Sophia couldn't react in time. She only sensed the imbalance, and then, her wheelchair was shoved off the cliff. The sensation of falling, descending into the endless void, lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to stop her heart. She screamed in panic, but the sound was swallowed by the quiet of the forest. When she hit the ground, an overwhelming pain spread throughout her body. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, only felt the paralysis and the brutality of what had just occurred. Her eyes opened wide, gazing at the sky above, but everything around her was blurred. She was stuck between rocks, unable to escape. Edward stood on the cliff, looking down at her with no hint of remorse. There was no panic or concern in his expression. On the contrary, in his eyes, there was a cold satisfaction. This was the moment Edward Montgomery knew that he had finally completed one of his darkest plans. Sophia couldn't believe her eyes. She knew her father had changed, but never did she imagine he could be so cruel. The feeling of being left in such a perilous situation, in a world where no one knew she needed help, made her feel as though everything had ended. But she couldn't give up. Though paralyzed and in pain, Sophia fought with every ounce of strength she had left. That afternoon, the sky hung heavy with gray clouds, dimming the light of the sun behind a thick veil. A sharp wind whispered through the forest trees, carrying with it a chill and a sense of unease. In that gloomy atmosphere, Snowy, the Montgomery family's loyal German shepherd, trotted alongside a black pickup truck as it climbed a narrow path into the remote, wooded hills. His erect ears picked up every sound, and his wet nose constantly sniffed the air, as if trying to detect something that was wrong. From the moment they left the mansion, Snowy had sensed something strange. He had always been a sensitive, devoted dog, especially close to young Sophia, the paralyzed daughter of the family, who would often rest her fragile hands on his back and whisper to him in the quiet of the night. But today, when Edward, the father, suddenly offered to take Sophia on a picnic alone, without telling the staff or anyone else, Snowy's instincts were on high alert. When the truck finally stopped near a cliffside surrounded by thick forest and far from civilization, Snowy growled softly. The scent on the wind shifted, sharper now, laced with sweat, cigarette smoke, and fear. Quietly, Snowy followed Edward and Sophia from a short distance, his amber eyes never straying from the man's every move. A premonition and a witness. Edward carried Sophia from the car, setting her gently near the edge of the cliff. The girl smiled faintly, still trusting, believing her father had brought her out to enjoy nature. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, her world would be forever changed. Snowy paced around them, barking softly, trying to draw attention, but Edward shouted sharply, "Get lost, Snowy!" The dog backed off, but not far. His worried eyes tracked Edward's movements every time the man turned away from his daughter. Then, in a terrifying moment of stillness, Edward slowly stepped behind Sophia, who sat at the edge of the cliff, her legs limp and useless. Silently, he raised both hands. Snowy barked ferociously. He lunged forward like a storm, grabbing at Edward's sleeve with his teeth. But Edward shoved him away violently. "Get off!" he screamed, and then, a push. Sophia screamed as her body tumbled off the cliff, falling into the void below. Snowy sprinted to the edge, barking in desperation, his paws scraping the ground. But she was gone. The struggle with despair. Edward stared down the cliff, his face cold and unmoved. No one saw, he muttered to himself, then turned away. But Snowy remained at the edge, unmoving. Then he turned and faced the man, his gaze no longer that of a mere dog. It was a look of judgment. Snowy began barking wildly, pacing back and forth, frantic, pleading for someone, anyone, to notice. But they were alone. Edward grew nervous. Seeing the dog refusing to leave, he opened the car door and whistled, "Come on, Snowy." But the dog just stood there. Still. Watching. And once again, those brown eyes seemed to say, "I know what you did." Frustrated and shaken, Edward got in the car and drove away, tires crushing dried leaves as the truck disappeared into the trees. Behind him, silence. Except for the echo of barking, and the one soul he couldn't silence. Snowy's lone journey. As the truck vanished into the forest, Snowy returned to the cliff's edge. He leaned over, peering down into the rocks below. Through the brambles and jagged stones, lay Sophia, bloody, broken, but miraculously alive. Her voice, weak and trembling, rose up faintly through the wind, "Snowy." And Snowy heard her. It was a whisper lost to the wind, but to the loyal German shepherd, it was a cry louder than thunder. He barked furiously, then began to run, through trees, across streams, toward the only place he knew might still hold help. The journey was brutal. At times, Snowy stumbled and fell, cutting his paws on thorns and stones. He swam across an icy creek, shaking from the cold. But in his mind, there was only Sophia, his friend, his sister, the one who had always loved him without fear or judgment. A ray of hope. Over 2 hours later, Snowy burst through a thicket and spotted a police vehicle parked by the roadside. Without hesitation, he ran to it, barking, jumping on the door, tail frantic. Inside, Lieutenant Harris blinked, startled by the dog's intensity. At first, he thought it was just a stray. But when Snowy tugged at his sleeve, barked again, and then ran a few steps toward the forest, only to look back, Harris's instincts kicked in. "There's something wrong," he muttered, starting the engine. With Snowy leading the way, they wound through the narrow forest trail until they reached the cliff. From there, the dog ran to a hidden footpath leading down the ravine. And there, among shattered stones and twisted brush, lay Sophia, barely breathing, but alive. The morning sun filtered softly through the ancient oaks of the Montgomery estate, casting long shadows across the cobblestone paths and rolling pastures. Everything appeared calm, serene even, but to Jack Miller, the longtime groundskeeper and estate supervisor, something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but a deep unease had crept into his chest the moment he stepped out of the cottage that morning. Maybe it was the way the air hung heavy with silence. Or maybe it was the absence of Sophia's voice. Her usual cheerful morning greeting hadn't come, and neither had her caretaker checked in, though the routine was never missed. Jack, a man in his early 40s with a sturdy build and an eye honed by years of observing subtle shifts in nature and people, paused outside the stables. Snowy, the family's loyal German shepherd, sat beside the empty horse trailer, ears perked and eyes fixed toward the forested trail behind the estate. The dog wasn't barking, but his stillness was unnatural, tense, almost like a coiled spring. "Snowy?" Jack called, stepping toward him. The dog whined and rose, circling Jack before dashing a few paces down the trail and stopping, looking back, tail rigid. Jack's brow furrowed. "What is it, boy?" Snowy barked once, sharp and deliberate, then darted forward again. This time, Jack followed without hesitation. Something was wrong. As they entered the woods, Snowy's pace quickened. Jack found himself jogging to keep up. The dense foliage swallowed the sound of their footsteps, and the world around them seemed to hold its breath. The deeper they went, the more Jack noticed the absence of birdsong. It was as though nature herself had been frightened into silence. Half a mile in, Jack found the first clue, a crushed patch of wildflowers, trampled in a way that didn't match any usual footpath. Then a small plastic container, one Sophia often carried for her medication, lay abandoned under a sycamore tree. His heart clenched. "Sophia?" No response. Snowy barked again and took off through the underbrush, his nose close to the ground. Jack followed, now moving faster, dread turning in his gut. He pulled out his phone, no signal. He cursed under his breath but didn't stop. Not now. Then he saw them, fresh tire marks. Not from a ranch vehicle. From something smaller. Edward's car. Snowy led him to the edge of the bluff, a place few ever ventured. It was beautiful, in a wild, dangerous way, a sheer cliff overlooking the ravine below, overgrown with vines and scattered rocks. And there, near the edge, Jack saw something that made his breath catch. Wheelchair tracks. They stopped abruptly at the cliff slip. "No." Jack stepped forward, scanning the drop. "Sophia." His voice echoed into the gorge, swallowed by the trees below. Snowy barked furiously now, pacing along the edge, tail thrashing. Then the dog began to whine, lowering his head, pressing his nose to a patch of disturbed earth. Jack knelt down and saw faint drag marks, as though something, or someone, had slid down the rocky slope. He didn't think. He just started climbing down. It wasn't easy. The rocks were sharp, and the descent was treacherous. Jack scraped his hands and arms, dirt and sweat clinging to his skin, but he didn't stop. Branches snapped underfoot, thorns tore at his clothes, but he kept pushing downward until he heard it. A faint, broken sob. He froze. "Sophia?" "Jack," came a whisper, so soft it nearly broke him. "I'm here." He found her minutes later, wedged between two rocks at the bottom of the ravine, half covered in leaves and dirt, her wheelchair shattered nearby. Her arms were scraped and bleeding, but her face lit up with recognition and relief. "Jack," she gasped. He pushed me." Jack's heart ached as he crouched beside her, brushing her hair from her bruised forehead. "I know, sweetheart. I'm here now. You're safe." Snowy barked from above, pacing furiously. Jack looked up, gauging the distance. They couldn't climb back the way he'd come. Sophia needed medical attention, fast. Jack activated the emergency beacon he carried for estate emergencies. Then he fashioned a splint for Sophia's leg using branches and strips from his flannel shirt. He stayed with her, talking to her softly, keeping her awake and alert as the minutes dragged on. Snowy didn't leave his post above, barking occasionally to guide the rescue team. His loyalty and instincts had led Jack here, had saved Sophia's life. Within the hour, the sound of chopper blades cut through the air, and paramedics descended via rope. Jack stepped back as they lifted Sophia into a stretcher, his hands trembling with relief. One medic turned to him. "You found her just in time. Any longer, and she might not have made it." Jack nodded silently, his eyes misted. As the helicopter rose, carrying Sophia to safety, Jack looked once more at the cliff, the place where Edward Montgomery had tried to silence his daughter. But the truth had survived. Because Snowy had seen. And because Jack had listened. And now it was time to make Edward answer for what he had done. The sun had long dipped below the horizon when Jack Miller finally reached the edge of the dense woods that bordered the Montgomery estate. The twilight air was thick with tension, the kind that clung to the skin like cold mist. Each step Jack took was driven by dread, a gnawing fear that something terrible had happened to Sophia. He had scoured the grounds for hours with no sign of her, and every unanswered call of her name echoed with hopelessness. Snowy, the family's loyal German shepherd, had been his silent guide throughout the search. The dog had been acting frantic, barking wildly and darting toward the cliffs with single-minded urgency. Jack knew something was wrong the moment he saw Snowy pacing by the stables without Edward. The animal had whined and tugged at Jack's pants with teeth as gentle as desperation itself. Now, under the pale shimmer of the moonlight, Snowy suddenly halted at the cliff's edge. He barked again, sharp and desperate, then looked back at Jack, eyes wide and ears pinned. Jack's breath caught. "Is she down there?" he whispered, his voice a trembling thread. The dog barked once more, confirming the unspoken truth. Jack dropped to his knees and peered down over the edge. The rocky slope fell sharply, littered with brambles and jagged outcrops. At first, there was nothing, only darkness and the occasional rustle of wind against the leaves. Then, a faint sound, a sob, soft and hoarse, rose up from the depths. "Sophia?" Jack called, his voice cracking. "Jack," came the faintest reply, a broken whisper, raw with pain. His heart leapt. She was alive. Without wasting another second, Jack grabbed his flashlight, tied a thick rope around a tree trunk, and began his descent. Snowy paced above, whining and watching his every movement, as though urging him onward. The terrain was treacherous. Rocks shifted beneath Jack's boots, thorns scratched his arms, and branches clawed at his face. Still, he climbed down, inch by careful inch, refusing to stop. Every second mattered. Every scrape was worth it if it brought him closer to her. Finally, his beam of light caught a glimpse of fabric, pale blue and stained with dirt, tangled among the brush. Just below, he saw Sophia lying half-curled, her wheelchair twisted and broken beside her. Her face was streaked with tears and grime, and her hands trembled as she tried to reach out toward him. Jack scrambled the last few feet and dropped to his knees beside her. Thank God, he breathed. Sophia, I've got you now. She sobbed again, this time out of relief. I didn't think anyone would come. Jack checked her for injuries. Her legs were bruised, though she couldn't feel them, and her arms bore scratches and gashes. More concerning, her skin was cold, too cold. You're safe now, Jack whispered, wrapping his coat around her trembling frame. We're going to get you out of here. Snowy barked from above. Jack looked up. Good boy. Stay there, we'll be up soon. The rescue wouldn't be easy. Jack fashioned a makeshift harness using the extra rope he'd brought. He wrapped it carefully around Sophia, ensuring it wouldn't cause her more pain. Then he tied the ends to himself, securing her to his back like a precious burden. You ready? He asked softly. Sophia gave a weak nod. The climb was brutal. The added weight strained every muscle in Jack's body. His fingers bled from gripping the jagged rocks. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Above them, Snowy barked again, as if cheering them on. Halfway up, Jack lost his footing and nearly slipped. His shoulder slammed into a rock, and he cried out in pain. Sophia gasped. I'm okay, he hissed through clenched teeth. Almost there. When they finally reached the top, Jack collapsed beside Sophia, gasping for breath. Snowy rushed to them, licking Sophia's face and whining as he nestled beside her. His tail wagged frantically, his body vibrating with joy. Sophia reached out a trembling hand and stroked Snowy's fur. You stayed with me. The dog whimpered, pressing his head into her lap. Jack smiled, tears welling in his eyes. He's the reason I found you. He never gave up. Jack called for an ambulance, his hands shaking. Within minutes, sirens echoed in the distance. Paramedics arrived, rushing to stabilize Sophia and transport her to the hospital. Jack insisted on riding with her, never once letting go of her hand. In the ambulance, Sophia finally whispered, it was Edward. Jack froze. What? He pushed me, she said, tears filling her eyes. He smiled, and then pushed me. Jack's jaw clenched. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the strange tension, Edward's cold demeanor, Snowy's panic. He felt sick. He said I was a burden, she choked out. Said the world would be better without me. Jack's hand tightened around hers. You're not a burden, Sophia. You were brave. And you were loved. At the hospital, doctors worked to treat Sophia's injuries and monitor for hypothermia. Jack sat in the waiting room, Snowy curled up at his feet. He couldn't stop replaying her words in his mind. How could Edward, her own father, do such a thing? Detectives arrived later that night. Jack told them everything. Sophia's statement confirmed the truth. Snowy, though unable to speak, was their silent witness, his presence the bridge between Sophia's near-death and her miraculous rescue. News of Edward's arrest spread quickly. The Montgomery family name, once respected, now stood tarnished by cruelty and betrayal. Days passed. Sophia slowly recovered, and Snowy never left her side. Jack visited every day, bringing her books, flowers, and gentle encouragement. Their bond deepened, not just from the rescue, but from shared understanding. They had both survived something dark, and together, they were finding light again. One afternoon, as Jack sat beside her, Sophia whispered, "You saved me, Jack, but Snowy? He never gave up on me." Jack looked at the German shepherd, who now lay with his head on Sophia's lap, eyes half closed but alert. "No," Jack said, smiling. "He's the real hero." Sophia reached out and hugged Snowy tightly. The dog let out a soft huff of contentment. And in that moment, surrounded by warmth, healing, and unwavering loyalty, she felt, perhaps for the first time in years, truly safe. The day Sophia returned to the Montgomery estate marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. she was no longer the same fragile girl who had been pushed off a cliff by the man she once called father. Though her body still bore the weight of trauma, both physical and emotional, her eyes reflected a renewed fire. And beside her, as constant and vigilant as ever, stood Snowy, the family's German shepherd, now hailed as a hero. Her recovery was neither swift nor easy. The first few days back at the estate were shrouded in silence. The medical team had stabilized her, ensuring that the injuries sustained during her fall wouldn't worsen. Miraculously, despite the days she had spent trapped and exposed to the elements, Sophia had survived with no infection. Her body was weak, her muscles atrophied from both her previous paralysis and the harrowing ordeal, but she was alive. That in itself was a miracle. Jack Miller, the estate supervisor, remained close throughout the early days. He had found her, he had brought her home, and he wasn't going to let her face the recovery alone. But it was Snowy who never left her side, curling up at the foot of her bed at night, resting his head on her lap during the day. The bond between them had deepened in the shadows of terror and survival. Where once he had been the family pet, Snowy was now her guardian angel in fur. One morning, as sunlight poured through the lace curtains of her bedroom, Sophia stirred and felt the gentle weight of Snowy's head on her thigh. She smiled faintly and reached down to stroke his ears. His tail thumped softly against the floor, a silent rhythm of comfort. "Good morning, my hero," she whispered. Snowy responded with a low, affectionate whine and a nudge of his nose against her hand. He could sense the pain in her, the fear, the lingering echo of betrayal. But more than that, he sensed her resilience. The physical therapy sessions began a week later. A young therapist named Mia was brought in to work with Sophia every morning. At first, Sophia barely managed to sit up on her own. Her muscles trembled with the effort, her breathing labored. But Snowy was always there, lying beside the mat as if absorbing her frustration. When she failed, he licked her hand. When she succeeded, however slightly, he barked once, a proud cheerleader. Weeks turned into months. Her progress was slow, but steady. She transitioned from bed to wheelchair, then to walker. The doctors had initially believed she might never stand again, but they hadn't accounted for Sophia's iron will or Snowy's unwavering support. One rainy afternoon, as the sky wept softly outside, Sophia stood on trembling legs in the physical therapy room. Her hands gripped the parallel bars, sweat beading on her brow. Mia stood ready to catch her, but it was Snowy she looked at for strength. He sat across from her, ears perked, eyes locked on hers. "One step, Sophia," Mia encouraged gently. Sophia swallowed hard. Her heart pounded. She stared at Snowy. And then, she lifted her foot. It was barely an inch. But it was a beginning. Cheers erupted in the room, and tears slipped down Sophia's cheeks. Snowy let out a proud bark and padded forward to nuzzle her leg. That night, she sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket, with Snowy curled beside her. Jack joined them, setting 2 mugs of cocoa on the table, one for him, one for Sophia. The warmth of the room, the crackle of flames, the gentle breathing of her dog, it all felt surreal. "He saved me," she murmured, staring into the fire. "I know," Jack replied softly. "But so did you." Over the following months, Sophia began reclaiming her life. She returned to reading, devoured books about courage, healing, and strength. She learned to paint with her left hand when her right refused to cooperate. She planted a garden, something her mother had loved before her passing, and spent afternoons tending to it, Snowy never more than a few feet away. Word of her survival and Snowy's loyalty spread. The local paper ran a story titled "The Girl Who Fought to Stand Again," and "The Dog Who Wouldn't Leave Her." Offers to feature them in magazines and interviews flooded in, but Sophia declined most of them. She wasn't interested in fame. She just wanted peace, and the chance to build a new future. Edward Montgomery was arrested and charged with attempted murder, thanks to Jack's persistence and the forensic evidence collected from the scene. But Sophia rarely spoke of him. She didn't want to dwell in that darkness. Instead, She focused on light, on healing, on gratitude. There was one particular moment, nearly a year after her fall, that marked a true turning point. She had been walking short distances with a cane, her steps still uncertain. One morning, she decided to walk down to the cliff where it had all happened. Jack and Mia hesitated to let her go, but Snowy's insistence swayed them. They walked together, woman and dog, down the path that once spelled her doom. The air was crisp, the wind whispering secrets through the tall grass. When they reached the edge, Sophia stood still, staring down at the rocks below. "I'm not afraid," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "Not anymore." Snowy leaned against her, warm and steady. "Because I'm not alone." From that day on, Sophia and Snowy became inseparable in the most profound way. They weren't just survivor and rescuer, they were soulmates, bound by a storm they had weathered together. She went on to write a memoir titled Where the Light Finds Us. The dedication read simply, "To Snowy, my strength, my shadow, my salvation." As time passed, Sophia's wounds slowly healed. But the most precious thing she regained wasn't just her ability to walk again, it was the renewed belief in true, unwavering love, found in the eyes and heart of a four-legged friend. Snowy didn't just help her survive the aftermath, he taught her how to rise from the place where she had once fallen. That path to recovery wasn't merely physical, it was a journey to reclaim her spirit, with a loyal companion who never left her side.